Welcome to the Neuromodulation Podcast, presented to you by the International Neuromodulation Society. Dive into the forefront of today's emerging neuromodulation techniques, insights, and ethical and clinical applications. Subscribe now to join the multidisciplinary collaboration of medical care providers, scientists, and engineers who are part of the global conversation that's shaping the future of healthcare.
Welcome to today's episode of the Neuromodulation Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Pilitsis. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much, Mandi, for having me.
So to kick things off, I'm curious to hear about your journey into medicine and neuromodulation. Can you share about that?
Sure. So I made an educated guess as a high school student, actually, where I entered a bachelor's MD program where, I did both of those degrees in 6 years instead of 8. And so that kind of freed me up to do a longer residency program. And so I spent 9 years in neurosurgery training with a PhD and my functional neurosurgery training. So being a functional neurosurgeon connected me with neuromodulation. Really it was halfway through my residency when I started to realize what a difference these therapies could make in the lives of patients that really steered me in that direction.
So you're coming out of your term as president of NANS, the North American Neuromodulation Society. You contribute to research. You are a mentor, an advocate in the field. You're an educator. Can you give me some insight into what you do to make all of that possible? How are you able to achieve so much?
Well, I think it's been a journey, and, I've had the opportunity to gain a lot of leadership skills along the way. One of the things that I was really fortunate to have had happen was, even when I was in residency, my mentors brought me to a lot of organized neurosurgery or neuromodulation events, and I started knowing people in those circles, and that allowed me to get involved even at that point. So, by the time I'd finished residency, my first major leadership position in organized medicine was in the AANS-CNS joint section on pain. I rose through the ranks there. And I think through organized medicine, one of the things that you get experience doing is leading meetings, putting together big initiatives, developing curriculum, and many of the things that you wouldn't get to do until later in your career. So I'm really fortunate to have had that journey along organized medicine. And then, using those skills, I was able to become a chair and then dean and now physician executive over 33 hospitals for functional neurosciences. So it's really been a journey. I think to get all that way, it is not me. It is a team and a community of supporters at every level. So, first and foremost, I have a wonderful husband and wonderful children that have been amazingly supportive. In terms of work, I have great research, clinical, admin teams that allow me to keep many balls up in the air, and I'm really thankful to that. And then, in the community, I just have had an abundance of friends and mentors and colleagues at all levels that were happy to share their insight, their mentorship, sponsorship, and coaching.
That said, I know you also do a whole lot of work. So I'm curious, how do you manage your time?
I do work hard, and, I think many people in these positions work hard. I think my favorite time to get anything done is early AM before anybody else is awake. It's been an interesting transition now that I'm on the Pacific time, because now everybody's awake on the East Coast when I'm trying to do that work. So I'm still adjusting a little bit to time zones. So, I think it's important to prioritize. One thing that has helped keep balance is that in my calendar, anything that's important to my family or important that I'm there, I treat that like any other meeting and make sure I am there and available for all those important events.
That's great. That said, what keeps you motivated on the tough days?
I think I want things to be better. I want more patients to have access to these therapies. I want all patients to have access to these therapies. I want to create better therapies and enable physicians to have the ability to provide those to their patients. So I think it's just a desire to, leave the field better than it was before I got involved.
What are the therapies that you've worked with throughout your career?
Yeah. So, I think I've spent the majority of my time in spinal cord stimulation and in deep brain stimulation, and now I'm excited about, other advances in the therapy and other interventional pain procedures, as well as focused ultrasound and some of the non-invasive neuromodulatory strategies.
Can you share which of these procedures you found have been the most sort of inspirational for you, or you've seen patient successes that have been the most impactful for your career?
It was deep brain stimulation that really moved me towards functional neurosurgery and neuromodulation. And, like so many people, just have had remarkable opportunities to give people their lives back. Treating pain is hard. Oftentimes, the patients that come to see us have had pain for, over a decade, sometimes 2 decades. And, there are so many factors that come into that. And, I think when you have somebody who's able to either get off opioids or enjoy their life or go back to work or do the things they love, sometimes those are the sweetest stories because of how hard everybody on the team, centered around the patient, including the patient first and foremost, has worked to get them there.
What are these patient teams looking like, the clinical teams that are supporting your patients?
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan of team in medicine. And, I learned that through deep brain stimulation. So, there's a team all along the journey. First, we work with neurologists and neuropsychiatrists and psychologists, as well as psychiatrists if we're doing, some psychosurgery type DBS. And we have a multidisciplinary team that gets together and discusses the patient and discusses what therapy to move forward with. Then we get into, the operating room, and, we have the nurses, the scrub techs, the anesthesia, the radiology team, the company representatives, often many nurses and nurse practitioners, PAs, residents, so many people that touch the patient along the hospital journey. And, then after the therapy, I tell the family members they're up because, oftentimes after you have, especially brain surgery, you want to get better right away. And sometimes to get people where they want to go, it takes 3 to 6 months. So it's really important for the patient to have a great support system at home in order to get them through this. And, oftentimes my patients are involved in talking with other patients in the community that are in similar situations to themselves.
So thinking about some of the barriers that patients navigate in care lends me to wonder, what barriers have you navigated in your career and in navigating the neuromodulation field?
Yeah. So, I think it's all a process. And, I think when you have big goals, you're in a hurry to accomplish them. And, I think one thing I would probably tell my younger self is, have a little bit more patience and you will get where you want to go. I think that I've done some, non-traditional type roles. So, my first chair job, I was chair of a basic science department. And, it took a minute because, I'm an MD PhD, but I spend part of my life in the clinic and part of my life in the lab. And these folks spent all their time in the lab. And so sometimes they looked at me as an outsider, and trying to get them to see me as not only an insider, but as somebody that could lead them forward was a challenge. And I think that, when you're talking about diversity of thought or diversity of disciplines, you can face those barriers. So having been a woman, I've approached similarly in the field where this may be something that's a little bit different than, what the status quo has been, and ensuring that we work together so that people can see me in that leadership role.
You mentioned wanting to optimize for more patients, perhaps earlier on in your career. Are there any other elements of your career that you would have done differently if given the chance? Or if you went back in time now, would you do anything differently?
There are plenty of things in my career that haven't worked out the way I had planned them to work out, or the way I thought they would work out. Having said that, there's the expression, jack of all trades, master of none, but there's a second part of that saying that, being a master of none is better than being a master of one. So all these experiences have made me the person I am today and have helped me to adapt, my outlook on life, my leadership skills, what I want to do next. in a positive, holistic way. So I'm glad I've had all the experiences that I've had.
Well, and with that said, you're truly a pioneer for women in the field. Everything from being a founding member of the INS's Women in Neuromodulation Committee to being the first female president of the North American Neuromodulation Society. Can you tell me what that journey has been like?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. And again, just drawing the parallels with organized medicine and, our actual day jobs or volunteer in our day jobs. It's been really enlightening to see the way the world works and, see how the sausage is made and how people move forward. I would say that I've met many more kind people and many more supportive people than, people that were throwing up roadblocks. But, I think there was a certain amount of things that I learned that, I never would have expected beforehand.
Do you have any guidance you can extend to women in the field when they are running into roadblocks?
First, surround yourself by people that will tell you can do it. And, because there are moments when we're all alone with our thoughts when we're wondering if we can do it, and you need people to be behind you and tell you that you can do it. So I think that's number one. Number two, it's a village. And, as I've risen through the ranks, I've really, been really fortunate to have a number of people that have had a lot of life experiences pulling for me and able to give me guidance in how to navigate situations that I haven't found myself in before. It is also, some of my dearest friends I've met through organized medicine, and having that kind of peer mentoring and peer support really is something I wouldn't trade for the world. I'm really thankful to have those people in my life.
Who are some of the biggest inspirations to you?
So, I think, again, my family is number one. And, making sure that I'm doing right by them is first and foremost important to me. I've been really so fortunate to work with so many great folks. A couple that come to mind are Josh Rosenau, David Provenzano, Konstantin Slavin, the incoming president of INS. So just a number of those folks who have been great friends and allies along the journey. I did have a fun time in NANS this past year because, we were in a building phase. We had changed, our management structure. So, the journey that Carrie Kramer and I had has been phenomenal. And likewise, on the INS side, Tia and Mary have been there from the beginning. And I'm so thankful for them and now for you.
Thanks. One thing that I can say for certain, just from having communicated with others in the field, is that you've also been an inspiration to many. And something I really admire is that you've consistently engaged as a mentor in the neuromodulation community. So can you speak to what your experience of being a mentor is like?
I think this is really important. And, I didn't get here by myself. And, I had so many people that were helping me along the way. And so it's really important to me to pay it forward and do that for other folks. I do that at all levels. So, from I think middle school is probably the youngest mentee that has been in my lab or worked with me, all the way up to, associate full professors, my peers, that I have enjoyed having a mentoring relationship with. I think that mentoring, I think we have in our mind that, picture somebody like in their 50s or 60s mentoring somebody in their 20s or 30s. I'm not sure that's reality. And oftentimes, that's one version of it, but oftentimes you can learn a lot from people at all levels. Like, for instance, my first medical student in the lab, there were two of them, they taught me more about being a mentor, than anybody else along the journey. So I think it goes in all directions.
Yeah, I think the concept of reverse mentorship where, my younger siblings and folks who have kids, that they end up being sometimes our biggest teachers.
Oh, 100%. And, I think just be open to, the lessons life has to teach you.
Yeah, curiosity. So I want to pop back to reflecting on the work that you've done regarding women in neuromodulation. What would you say are some of the projects you've done or initiatives that you've taken charge on that have built out the visibility of women in neuromodulation, created more access, or maybe brought awareness to important themes that we need to address to support women in this space?
Yeah. So, again, when I was a resident, I was lucky enough to have a couple of female mentors that brought me to neurosurgery meetings. And, there was a women in neurosurgery group. And there, I rose through the ranks of that organization and learned a lot, both in what to do and what I would do differently. So in 2014, I was tapped as the first female board member at NANS. I was an ex officio member, and my marching orders were to set up a women in neuromodulation group. And, I think maybe three key things I did that I think made a difference and were carried forth. So, I may have had the initial thought, but so many people have moved that forward, was one, to make this about men and women and, make sure that we were all supporting one another. Two, at that time, we didn't have a critical mass of women neuromodulators. So, we made sure to invite all women in neuromodulation, whether it be, the staff of different organizations, whether it be the company folks, and got this core group and number of people together. So I think that was something else that spurred us forward. And the third thing was, right around that time, I became involved heavily in the scientific program committee of NANS and, helped to work to set a goal to make sure that we had 25% of speakers on the podium being women. And, I think that helped people see women up there and provide behaviors to model and inspiration. So I think those were some of the key things that started this journey.
It's incredible. And I'm thinking back to, we have the pleasure of recording right now in Vancouver at the 16th World Congress of the INS. And at the Women in Neuromodulation reception last night, Professor Mark Russo said a couple of words, and so did yourself. And he had mentioned receiving the question, how long do we need to have a Women in Neuromodulation group? And his comment was, he said, I had to think on that a good bit, but he had said, we need to get to a point where we have 50% women as chapter presidents of our organization, 50% women on our executive board. And until we have that level of visibility within the industry, we need to create spaces to support women. That said, I'm curious, do you agree with this sentiment? How long do you agree with this sentiment?
Absolutely. I think that, Mark is just an inspiration all in his own right. And, I think those are aspirational goals as to what we should be aiming for. I think we need to coach and develop women to ensure that not only are they serving in those roles, but they have the chance to advance along the executive committee. And, I think if we're able to do it in this organization, that'll be really effective in women going back to their chapters internationally where they may not have reached that critical mass. But I think, similar to how I learned these skills in organized medicine, I think the opportunity to learn those things is something the society really could do to expand its reach to women in all countries.
And right now, where the INS board sits is about 20.5% of our chapter presidents, broader executive board, include women. What advice would you give to women in the field who are interested in pursuing leadership opportunities?
Mm-hmm. So I think that first, let Tia know you're interested, and there are plenty of committees and plenty of jobs to be done. And I think it's important to get visibility in those committees as a first line. And then, when you are on those committees, deliver the work. This is something you have to be committed to. We all have so many different directions we're being pulled in, but make sure to do good work, show up, and move whatever it is that you're assigned forward. I think that will allow you to rise up through the ranks. And I think on the INS side, I was so glad to hear Professor Russo say what he said, in that there has to be a holistic review of the people that are being selected for leadership positions in this organization and in all organizations.
One thing that I'm aware that you've spoken about in the past and done a presentation on is around the gender pay gap in medicine for women. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was an interesting article, colleagues in neurosurgery, that came out that showed even with Medicare rates that women were earning less than men. And there could be many reasons for this, So, I think what was interesting about that study is it took away what we think about all the biases that could occur in hiring or in ensuring equity and pay across practices, because it was only looking at CMS payments, which should really be an objective metric, and there really shouldn't be any variability there. So then you wonder about, the other ways that this could happen. And is there a difference between the way men and women code what they're doing? Is there a difference in billing practices? Who's doing the coding? Are they accurately reflecting everybody's work? So just so many layers where there's the potential for a bias to be introduced that we don't even really think about.
Do you have a sense of how much you think bias has influenced your career?
I've made some good decisions. I've made some bad decisions. Some of the good decisions I made were, early on in my training, to go to places that had graduated women and had women on faculty. And, I didn't really have a lot of interest in being a novelty. Having said that, I think that when you do things differently and you have a different style than other people, no matter what that diversity is, you have to work hard to get people to open their minds to just a different approach to things. So, I think there's been a lot of hard work and a lot of behind the scenes, coaching of folks to understand, why diversity is important and how that can make for a more effective organization.
Would you say that seeking out mentors throughout your career was particularly important for your evolution into leadership? And how would you recommend that folks look to find mentors in their own careers?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what I have done in every aspect of, my life is I look for excellent partners. So, when I am referring one of my patients to somebody, I try to figure out who's the best and who is going to be best for the problem they need help with. And likewise, when I'm thinking about questions that I have, I go through a mental Rolodex of people who I have seen do well at certain things, and I reach out to them, and I diversify my questions and tap some people for different things, and so I don't just bug one person all the time. But I think that's a way to approach developing mentors too. It's far less awkward than the will you be my mentor conversation. But if you say, hey, I really thought what you said at that meeting was it really resonated with me, can I run a scenario by you? I think that's really important. And then I think you also have to be careful of people that, may not have your best interest in mind. And so, it would be wonderful if everybody in the world had your best interest in mind. But the higher you go up the food chain, so to speak, more times you have to worry about, the different viewpoints people have that may not have your success at first and foremost.
Do you have any sentiments around how you approach both advocating for yourself while also navigating circumstances where professionalism might be challenged, where people aren't necessarily giving you the respect or dignity that's warranted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for me, frankly, that's a work in progress. I think sometimes my default is a female neurosurgeon. And, when I feel like I'm not being treated fairly, I go on the offensive. And that is not the best strategy. I think there are times where that works, but, if we did that every time something came up, it loses its effectiveness, first and foremost, and it doesn't accomplish what you set out to accomplish. So, I think taking a deep breath, reflecting, figuring out how you can provide the information that you want delivered in a non-confrontational way is something I work towards every day.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions around, if you're navigating folks that say that are superior to you and there are roadblocks that you're running into, do you have any strategies you found that you can recommend to other people to look to sort of develop that over time?
Yeah, so I try to, a lot of these conversations that you have, first you have to take the emotion out of it. And then I try to look at it like a negotiation. So I try to understand what makes the other person tick generally, what's their style? How do you reach consensus with them? And, then what's that barrier and what do they want? And how can you make it a situation where you both can benefit? And I think that's the right strategy. And, I think oftentimes in a negotiation, everybody hurts a little bit is the best type of negotiation. So you might not get everything you want. You probably won't get everything you want, but, think about what's really important to you and focus on that and, let some of the small stuff go.
Sort of seems like you approach it similarly to your value in team as medicine, or team in medicine.
Yeah. And, I think that's true. I think everybody has a role to play in all these, in patient care and hospital administration and society administration, and understanding what their role is and what their, red lines are and what their operating manual is and how you can make yours go along with theirs is, how you can get stuff done.
How would you say you've seen patient care evolve since the start of your career?
I think we have a lot better therapies. So, I think spinal cord stimulation is a great example where we have far different leads, far different waveforms, far different battery types. And just ways to deliver care. And I think similar as in deep brain stimulation. I think there's now a better understanding that patients have to live with these devices. And so how can you make this more livable? You should ask yourself questions, on deep brain stimulation cases. Do you have to shave all the hair? Because that's something that really patients hate. And, I would hate as a patient. Where should you put that battery based on, the patient's body? Because not all bodies are the same. And for whatever reason, women get explanted at a higher rate than men. Oftentimes, I think part of the problem is, the devices and where we put them. So, I think just personalizing care and making sure that you're treating the right patient with the right therapy at the right time.
What about your experience as an educator? You're at the University of Arizona right now. Can you tell me a bit about your role and what your professorial journey has looked like?
Yeah. So it was interesting, when I started, my first job was at University of Massachusetts, and we didn't have neurosurgery residents, and we had med students. And I quickly realized the mutual benefits that working with medical students had for both parties. These are highly intelligent, highly motivated people that want to learn about research, want to learn everything there is about medicine. And at the same point, when we're doing research, we have lots of jobs that need to be done that we don't have time to do, but we have time to oversee. So, that started my relationship with working with medical students. And, I think I'm at over like 220 medical student or mentees in my career that have all done really well, and most of those around a research project. And so, I think the opportunity to give people their first experience with research and give people their first experience in working with a team or at least a healthcare team is something invaluable. It also gives students a sense of self where, when you're a student, sometimes you're like the low man or woman on the totem pole. And, this allowed for people to get to know people at all levels and work with people and, be a valuable member of the team.
What about research? What role has that played in your career?
I've been committed to research for as long as I can remember. I never really made up my mind about medicine or science, and, ended up getting a PhD during my residency program. When I started out, I had a couple of med students and a really small $30,000 grant. And, that was my first foray into research, and, started meeting a number of folks and developing relationships with people I still work with to this day. So, I think since that time, we, have NIH funding and have had funding for the last 15 years. And we also have done a variety of clinical trials. So I think that the opportunity to better, the therapies being given to patients, the opportunity to provide today's therapies to patients in the local community, as well as to train the next generation, has been really one of my favorite things that I've done.
Can you scale out? Let's take a bird's eye view. I'm curious if you can give me an understanding of how your day-to-day looks while you're balancing being an educator, being a clinician, being a mentor. How do you mix your time?
Again, I am so lucky to have so many teams of people to help me with a variety of things. So, I think the most important thing is almost, having that daily huddle with your respective teams, your clinical team, your research team, your admin team, so that everybody has, knows what they're doing that day or that week, or knows where the priorities are, and, then letting people kind of do their thing. And, I think by having those meetings, setting those expectations, and then letting people accomplish them, a number of people like working in that way. And that helps me because then, rather than being the person that puts the orders in on the patient or the person that does all the IRBs, I can oversee those things, but, have a number of people doing them so that I can do multiple things at once. Not that, you should do that, but, I can accomplish much more.
And at the risk that someone might not know, what's an IRB?
Oh, sorry. Institutional Review Board. So a research protocol.
Okay. So looking back on your term as president of the North American Neuromodulation Society, or NANS, can you share some of the highlights of that experience and what you feel most proud of from your term?
I had the opportunity to work with great staff and great faculty volunteers to really move the society forward. I think one of the huge accomplishments was that we put together a strategic plan. And so, designated, those goals. And, then I think we improved on our communication with not just the board knowing about what the strategic plan was, but sharing that with our membership, because, societies exist for the good of their members and, for the patients they treat.
You've spoken a lot about the team that you have. So how do you go about building a team? Once you have your team, how do you go about team building? The leader, what would you say? How do you discern who to bring onto your team?
Great questions. So I've been fortunate to have a number of people that have been my team members and, have, been with me since Albany and then in Florida and now in Arizona. And, am lucky to have them continue to work with me and our group. And, so I think by having that core, it allows us to, develop our teams a little bit more rapidly because, there's multiple people doing multiple things with different working styles and different jobs that need to be done. I'm a high achiever and, I think that high achievers like to work with high achievers. And so I think sometimes people self-select to be on my team or off my team. And, I think it's important to make sure the team you're on is the right fit for you. And then I think as a leader, making sure that, the person that you're bringing on isn't just a superstar, but is a superstar that can work within the parameters your team works in. So there can be plenty of people that may have been smarter or may have, had more NIH funding or may do this and that. But if they can't work a group, they're probably not the right person.
Well said. So one thing I'm curious about, and I just say this in the sense that I really admire this about you, is that despite being a high achiever, you have maintained humility in a really impressive way, in my perspective. And so I'm curious how you go about sustaining being as humble as you are, despite, granted, you've done so much.
No. Well, thank you. That's really you. I think my whole goal in this is really leave the world a better place than it was before I was in it. And, I think that's my goal in work as well as my personal life. And I think when you think about things in those big terms, you're like a small part of it. And, what you're doing is so small and the huge magnitude of the world that, I don't know that there's any room for anything but humility.
Beautifully said. So what is next for you? You're coming out of your presidency at NANS, and yet you still have a very robust life. It would be reasonable if you just took a breather, but is there a project that's on the horizon that you're particularly excited about, or any new ventures that you're exploring?
Yeah, so I think from a personal standpoint, I'm excited to get my family out to Arizona with me. They're coming in a month. From my actual job, I'm excited to see where we can take our work further with the just embarrassment of riches we have around us now in Arizona, and figuring out how we can be a good part of that community. And then from a leadership and society standpoint, I will be president of the American Society of Stereotactic and Functional Neurosurgery in June. So that's a 2-year term.
Exciting news. Congrats.
Thank you.
Tia Safatsis, our executive director at the INS, had mentioned to me yesterday that you had brought your daughter along with you to a conference at one point, one of the congresses. I'm curious if you're open to sharing what your family unit is made up of and how you've navigated also balancing being a parent with this career journey.
So I'm married to my husband, Tim, and I have a son, Ryan, and a daughter, Lauren. And Lauren actually has been to 2 INSs in Edinburgh and in Sydney. And what I had tried to do, especially when the kids were a little bit younger and had a little bit more flexibility with their school schedule, was make sure I brought a kid on one trip a year, each one separately. And so I think that was something that was really meaningful and a special time that, we had together. So, I think when I got here, I took a picture of the badge and sent it to Lauren, and, she smiled, remembering her previous INSs.
I love that. What led you to bring your daughter to congresses?
I think it was, often these meetings are in great cities. And, I think it's important not only to be here for the science, but, also to see the city that the meeting's in. And I thought it would be great for my kids to have that experience too.
Well, and with the international nature of this field, I can anticipate it's also fun for them to get to put a face to the names that they're hearing about from you over the years.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that they will remember looking back on.
Beautiful. I like to close the show by looking to the future. I'm curious, are there any innovations within neuromodulation that you're most excited about or that you'd like to contribute to along your way?
Again, I think the 2 things that, I really am focused on, from a research perspective, again, building better mousetraps, improving the therapies that we have to deliver to patients. And I think any innovations that move us forward in that direction, I'm thrilled to be a part of. I think the second thing is access. And, we know that neuromodulation therapies are extremely underutilized by patients that are eligible for them. And, that gets worse based on different socioeconomics and certain environments. And so, trying to figure out a way that we can make sure that all patients have access to these therapies is really important to me.
Is there anything that we've missed today that you'd like to add to share with listeners?
I would just like to thank you and INS for the opportunity. It's a great society with great meetings that really accomplishes a lofty goal of globalizing the information on neuromodulation and ensuring that the best training and information is spread around the world.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for being here today. It's always a pleasure to cross paths with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.